The gun was heavy, but the ledger was heavier. Nora hadn't slept in 48 hours, meticulously burying Gabriel's sins in spreadsheets while he stood guard by the door. Exhaustion finally won, dragging her into a dreamless void against the steady, thumping rhythm of his chest. It was the safest she'd felt in months, but the safety was a lie. When her eyes fluttered open to the pale morning light, the scent of coffee was drowned out by the harsh, metallic click of a revolver. The glow of the laptop screen was a harsh, unforgiving blue in the dimness of the safe house. It cast long, distorted shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. Nora rubbed her eyes, pressing the heels of her palms hard enough into her sockets to see bursts of static. Her spine felt like a column of crushed glass. She blinked, trying to force the rows of numbers on the spreadsheet to stop vibrating. $3 million. It didn't just vanish. Money was physical, even when it was digital. It left footprints. It took time to hide, time to launder, and time to bleed out of an organization as tightly controlled as Gabriel's. Yet someone had found a vein and opened it. She reached for the styrofoam cup on the coffee table. The coffee was stone cold, tasting of burnt grounds and ash, but she swallowed it anyway. The caffeine had stopped working 12 hours ago. Now it was just a ritual to keep her hands moving. Gabriel sat in the armchair in the corner. He hadn't moved in an hour. If she hadn't known better, she would have thought he was a statue carved from shadows and tailored wool. His jacket was discarded over the back of a dining chair, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to expose the ink crawling up his forearms. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the rain lashing against the reinforced glass of the cabin window, a glass of amber liquid resting on his knee. "You're grinding your teeth," he said. His voice was low, gravelly, carrying easily across the quiet room. Nora stopped chewing on the inside of her cheek. "I'm looking for a ghost in a machine built by criminals. Grinding my teeth is the baseline. Take a break, Nora. If I stop now, I lose the thread." She hit the down arrow key, scrolling through another endless column of shell company transactions. The offshore accounts in Cyprus were a decoy. Whoever is siphoning your cash is doing it closer to home. They're routing it through the legitimate front companies, the construction firms, the waste management contracts. Gabriel finally turned his head. His eyes were dark, unreadable in the low light. "Are you telling me it's someone inside the family?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, heavily laden with impending violence. Nora didn't flinch. She had spent the last 2 years fixing the finances of a man who could order a city block leveled with a whisper. You didn't survive in this ecosystem by being timid. You survived by being indispensable and by being right. I'm telling you that whoever did this had your security clearances, knew the exact dates of your cash drops, and understood the routing algorithms better than your own tech guys. She hit a few more keys, pulling up a secondary ledger. It's an inside job, and they're getting sloppy, or bold. Gabriel set his glass down. The ice clinked against the crystal. He stood, moving with that quiet, heavy grace that always made the air in the room feel instantly thinner. He walked over to the leather sofa, where Nora was hunched over the coffee table, and sat down heavily beside her. The cushions dipped under his weight. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, peering at the screen. The proximity was startling. She could smell him. Rainwater, old leather, the sharp tang of gunpowder, and the distinct, clean scent of expensive soap. "Show me," he said. Nora pointed a trembling finger at the monitor. "Here, the structural steel invoices for the high-rise downtown. They're over-invoicing by exactly 14% on every shipment. The excess funds are being diverted to a holding company in Delaware. A company that was registered 3 days after you promoted your new underboss. Gabriel stared at the numbers. He didn't blink. The muscles in his jaw feathered, tightening and releasing. He didn't erupt. He didn't swear. The quiet was worse. It was the sudden, dead calm before a hurricane makes landfall. "Keep digging," he instructed softly. "I want a name attached to that Delaware holding company by morning." "I can't," Nora whispered. Her voice cracked. She hadn't realized how completely drained she was until she tried to speak. "My brain is misfiring, Gabriel. I'm looking at 4s and seeing 9s. Give me an hour. Just let me close my eyes for an hour." He turned his head to look at her. She was a mess. Her hair was falling out of its messy knot. Dark circles bruised the skin under her eyes, and she was shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash. The coldness in his eyes dialed back, replaced by something heavier. "Lean back," he said. "I just need to finish this routing number." "Nora, stop." He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently but firmly closing the laptop lid. The sudden absence of the blue light plunged the room into a deep, heavy gloom, lit only by the single amber lamp in the corner. "You're useless to me, dead from a stroke. Lean back." She didn't have the strength to argue. She slumped back into the deep leather of the sofa, letting her head loll sideways. Gabriel shifted, extending his legs out, his wide shoulders taking up most of the space. "1 hour," she mumbled, her eyelids already turning to lead. "Sleep," he ordered quietly. She let her eyes close. The cold of the room seeped into her bones, making her shiver. Without a word, Gabriel shifted closer. He didn't wrap an arm around her, didn't make a show of it. He just became a solid, radiating wall of heat beside her. Gravity and sheer exhaustion did the rest. Slowly, imperceptibly, Nora's posture slackened. Her head tilted, sliding down the leather cushion until her cheek met the heavy wool of his shirt. She expected him to push her away. He was not a man who tolerated physical affection, let alone weakness. But he didn't move. She heard the slow, deep intake of his breath, felt the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her ear. It was a metronome, a biological clock that grounded her frantic, spinning mind. The rain battered the windows. The wind howled through the pines outside the safe house. But inside, anchored against the chest of a man who killed for a living, Nora fell into the deepest, blackest sleep she had known in years. Consciousness returned not as a gradual lightening, but as a slow, confusing ache. Nora's neck was stiff. Her mouth tasted like copper and stale air. She didn't open her eyes immediately, clinging to the heavy narcotic pull of sleep. She was warm. Too warm for the drafty cabin in the Catskills, and the surface beneath her wasn't the slick, cold leather of the sofa. It was firm, rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. She took a slow breath, inhaling the deep, masculine scent of cedar and washed cotton. Memory crashed back into her skull. The audit, the missing millions, the laptop. Gabriel. Her eyes snapped open. The room was bathed in the thin, grey light of early dawn. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating fog that pressed against the windows like wet cotton. She was sprawled across the sofa, her legs tangled in a woven throw blanket. Someone, he, must have pulled over her. Her cheek was plastered to Gabriel's chest. He was still asleep, or at least his breathing suggested it. One of his heavy arms rested loosely across her waist, an unconscious gesture of possession or protection. She froze, terrified to move, terrified to wake him. The intimacy of the position felt dangerous, more dangerous than the cooked books on the table. She listened. The cabin was profoundly quiet. No wind, no rain, just the rhythmic thump-thump against her ear. Then, the rhythm changed. Gabriel's heartbeat didn't spike, but it paused, missing a single beat before resuming at a slightly faster, harder pace. The arm across her waist tightened, the muscles shifting from relaxed sleep to rigid tension in a fraction of a second. He was awake. Nora lifted her head, ready to apologize, ready to scramble backward, but a massive hand clamped over her mouth. Gabriel's eyes were open. They weren't groggy. They were completely, terrifyingly alert, fixed on the front window. He pressed a finger to his own lips, his face inches from hers. The message was clear. Do not make a sound. Nora's stomach plummeted. She nodded slowly. He released her mouth, his hand dropping smoothly to his waist. He slid a matte black pistol from the holster at his hip. The silence in the room stretched, pulling tight like a piano wire. Nora strained to hear what had woken him. At first there was nothing, just the ringing in her own ears. And then she heard it, the wet, sucking sound of a boot lifting out of the mud on the front porch. It was faint. A normal person would have missed it entirely. But Gabriel lived in a world where missing a sound meant dying. He moved with startling speed, rolling off the sofa and pulling Nora down with him in one fluid motion. They hit the hardwood floor, just as the front window shattered. It didn't explode with a loud bang. It was a sharp, biting crack, followed by the cascading tinkle of falling glass. A suppressed weapon. "Crawl!" Gabriel hissed, gripping the collar of her sweater and shoving her toward the kitchen island. "Stay flat." Nora scrambled on her hands and knees, splinters of glass biting into her palms. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She threw herself behind the heavy oak cabinets of the kitchen island just as the front door was kicked off its hinges. The wood splintered with a deafening crack. Heavy boots pounded into the entryway. "Clear the left! Check the back rooms!" A voice barked. Nora curled into a ball, pressing her back against the cabinet. She looked at Gabriel. He was crouched at the edge of the island, his gun raised, his face an emotionless mask. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were tracking the sounds, calculating angles. 3 men, Nora thought, her analytical brain desperately trying to find order in the chaos. Heavy footsteps, tactical gear. They didn't come to talk. "They found the relay," Gabriel muttered, almost to himself. He checked his magazine, slamming it back into the grip with a sharp click. Declan's people. The name sent a spike of ice through her veins. Declan Walsh, the rival syndicate. If Declan's men were here, it meant the mole hadn't just stolen money. They had sold Gabriel out entirely. The numbers on the laptop didn't matter anymore. A shadow moved across the hallway entrance. Gabriel didn't hesitate. He leaned out, fired twice. 2 sharp, cracking reports that echoed painfully in the confined space, and pulled back. A heavy thud sounded in the hall, followed by a wet gargle. "Contact!" someone screamed from the living room. Gunfire erupted. The kitchen cabinets above Nora's head exploded, raining wood chips, ceramic shards, and white flour down over them. The noise was absolute, a physical force that vibrated in her teeth. Nora covered her head, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to make herself as small as possible. Gabriel grabbed her shoulder, his grip bruising. "We can't hold this box. The back door leads to the tree line. When I move, you run. You don't look back. You don't stop. I can't outrun them," Nora gasped, her voice trembling. "You won't have to," Gabriel said, his eyes finally locking onto hers. The coldness was back, absolute and lethal. "I'm going to kill them. Just get out of the crossfire." He didn't wait for her to agree. He racked the slide of his gun, took a breath, and stood up into the storm. Gabriel stood up into the crossfire, and the kitchen disintegrated. Nora didn't look back to see the men who were trying to kill them. She obeyed the finality in his voice, keeping her head tucked beneath the level of the granite countertops as she scrambled on all fours toward the rear of the cabin. Above her, the air was a chaotic storm of pulverized drywall, shattered ceramic mugs, and the sharp, deafening cracks of semi-automatic fire. She reached the back door. The deadbolt was stiff. Her hands were shaking so violently she couldn't grip the brass latch. She wiped her palms on her slacks, smearing drywall dust into the fabric, grabbed the metal with both hands, and twisted. The lock gave way. She shoved her weight against the heavy oak door. It swung outward, spilling her onto the wet, rotting wood of the back deck. The cold morning air hit her lungs like swallowed glass. Fog rolled heavily off the Catskill Mountains, swallowing the tree line 50 yards away. The silence outside was a jarring contrast to the violence inside. For a split second, Nora hesitated on the edge of the deck. Leaving the cabin meant stepping into a sprawling, unforgiving wilderness. She was an auditor. Her entire world was built on ledgers, predictive models, and risk assessment. There was no algorithm for this. A heavy slug punched through the wall beside the doorframe, showering her shoulder with splinters. The algorithm was run. Nora vaulted over the low railing, landing hard in the slick, freezing mud. She lost her footing immediately, sliding to her knees and tearing the fabric of her trousers. She scrambled up, ignoring the sting, and sprinted for the pines. She didn't know how to run tactically. She just ran flat out, her boots slipping on wet leaves and exposed roots. The fog embraced her, thick and grey, immediately muting the colours of the forest. The cabin vanished behind her after 30 yards. Then came the sounds. She was a numbers person, accustomed to finding patterns in chaos. As she leaned against the rough bark of an ancient pine to catch her breath, her brain automatically began counting the gunshots echoing through the mist. Crack, crack, crack. That was Gabriel's weapon, a precise, rhythmic cadence, controlled pairs. Bam, 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 bam. That was the assailants, frantic, spraying the room, panicked. Crack. A pause, crack, and then nothing. Nora pressed her back against the tree, sliding down until she was sitting in the damp moss. Her chest heaved, pulling in jagged, freezing breaths. The silence stretching out from the cabin was heavier than the gunfire. It felt absolute. Final. 3 minutes passed. The forest was entirely still, save for the steady drip of condensation falling from the pine needles. If Gabriel was dead, the men would spread out. They would find her footprints in the mud. They would track her. She needed to move, to keep going deeper into the mountains, but her legs refused to cooperate. Her muscles had turned to water. A twig snapped. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the suffocating quiet of the fog, it sounded like a firecracker. Nora clamped a hand over her own mouth to trap a sob. She pressed herself harder against the bark, closing her eyes, trying to merge with the shadows. Heavy footsteps approached. They were slow, deliberate. The crunch of wet leaves, the drag of a boot. Nora. The voice was low, strained, and rough like crushed gravel. She opened her eyes and exhaled a ragged breath. Gabriel materialized out of the grey mist. He looked like a ghost, violently tethered to the physical world. His white shirt was smeared with grease, drywall dust, and a dark, heavy stain spreading across his left side, just below the ribs. His breathing was shallow, his face entirely devoid of color, but his eyes were sharp. He didn't have his jacket. His gun was still in his right hand, angled downward. "You stopped," he said, stopping a few feet away from her. He leaned his shoulder against a neighboring trunk. I couldn't breathe, Nora managed to say, her voice shaking. She stared at his side. The dark stain was growing, soaking into the waist of his trousers. You're hit, through and through. Missed the vitals. He didn't look down at it. He looked back the way he had come. 3 inside. Declan sent a heavy crew, but they were sloppy, relied on the element of surprise. When that failed, they didn't know how to adjust. Are they... She couldn't finish the sentence. They won't follow us, Gabriel said flatly. It wasn't a boast. It was an inventory report. But they weren't the only ones. A team like that doesn't operate without a secondary perimeter. They'll have watchers on the main road, maybe a vehicle a mile down the trail. We can't stay here. I don't even know where here is, Nora said, finally pushing herself up from the mud. Her legs trembled violently. We're miles from the highway. We have no car, no phones. My laptop is still inside. The laptop is scrap metal. I put a round through the hard drive before I left the kitchen. Gabriel pushed off the tree. He winced, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw before smoothing his expression back into stone. We walk north. There's an old logging road about 4 miles from here. I have a cache buried near an abandoned way station. Cache, burners, medical supplies. 4 miles, Nora repeated, looking at the dense rising terrain ahead of them. Gabriel, you're bleeding out. You won't make it 4 miles over this elevation. He walked past her, his gait heavy, but relentlessly steady. I don't have the luxury of not making it, Nora. And neither do you. Walk. The fog did not lift. It only grew denser, clinging to the damp earth like a heavy woolen blanket. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and wet rock. Nora focused entirely on the broad, solid line of Gabriel's back. He moved with a punishing rhythm, pushing through tangled underbrush and scaling slick, moss-covered inclines without a word of complaint. But Nora was an auditor. She tracked deviations from the baseline, and Gabriel's baseline was deteriorating. His right leg dragged slightly every 3rd step. His shoulders, usually perfectly level, were canted to the left as he subconsciously tried to protect his injured side. The dark stain on his shirt had stopped expanding, but the fabric was saturated and heavy. They had been walking for 2 hours. Nora's lungs burned, and her hands were numb, scratched raw by thorny branches she had blindly grabbed for balance. "Stop!" Nora gasped, her boot slipping on a slick slate outcropping. She went down hard on one knee. Gabriel paused, turning slowly. His face was slick with a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the exertion. His eyes were slightly unfocused, the pupils blown wide in the dim light. "Get up," he said. His voice lacked its usual commanding resonance. It was thin, reedy. "No." Nora forced herself to stand, ignoring the throbbing pain in her kneecap. She pointed to a deep hollow beneath a massive, overhanging shelf of slate rock just off the deer trail they were following. It was dry underneath, sheltered by decades of fallen pine needles. "We stop here for 10 minutes. If you pass out from shock on the side of a ridge, I can't carry you. You're too heavy, and I don't know the way." Gabriel looked at the overhang. He calculated the variables, his eyes scanning the tree line, listening to the heavy silence of the woods. Slowly he nodded. He didn't walk to the shelter. He waded toward it, his legs finally losing their mechanical precision. He ducked under the rock shelf and sank down against the stone wall. His head fell back, hitting the slate with a dull thud. He closed his eyes, his breathing coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Nora crawled under the overhang beside him. The air here was slightly warmer, trapped by the stone. "Let me see it," she said, reaching for the hem of his ruined shirt. Gabriel's hand shot out, clamping around her wrist. His grip was weak, lacking the bone-crushing strength he usually possessed. He opened his eyes. "Don't. You need pressure on the exit wound," Nora stated firmly. The fear that had paralyzed her at the cabin was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical necessity. She was back to fixing a broken ledger, only this time the asset was bleeding. "If it's still seeping, you'll drop your blood pressure too low to keep walking." "Let go of my wrist, Gabriel." He stared at her for a long second, assessing the hard set of her jaw. Slowly, his fingers uncurled. Nora pulled the shirt up. The entry wound on his side was small, a neat, dark puncture. The exit wound on his back was larger, ragged, and sluggishly weeping dark fluid. She didn't hesitate. She unbuttoned her cardigan, peeled it off, and pulled her cotton undershirt over her head. She shivered violently in her bra and the heavy cardigan, but she folded the undershirt into a thick pad. "Lean forward," she instructed. Gabriel complied, gritting his teeth as the movement pulled at the torn muscle. Nora pressed the makeshift bandage hard against the exit wound, leaning her weight into it to apply maximum pressure. Gabriel let out a sharp, involuntary hiss, his hands clenching into fists against the dirt. "Keep breathing," she said, her voice dropping to a calm, steady murmur. She realized her face was only inches from his neck. She could feel the erratic, racing pulse of his carotid artery. "Just focus on the air." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the distant, muted caw of a raven. "The Delaware Holding Company," Gabriel said suddenly, his voice raspy. Nora blinked. "What?" "Before I fell asleep. You said the money was moving to a holding company in Delaware. Registered 3 days after I promoted the new underboss." He didn't turn his head, but she could feel the tension radiating off him, separate from the pain of the wound. "You didn't give me the name." Nora kept the pressure steady. Her hands were sticky. "I didn't have a name yet. I just had the incorporation dates and the routing numbers. The LLC was a shell, layered behind 2 other shells in Panama." "Who is the underboss, Nora?" He knew the answer. He just wanted to hear her say it out loud. "Colin," she said softly. "Colin Walsh." Gabriel let out a slow, heavy breath. It sounded like a laugh devoid of any humor. "Declan's younger brother. We brought him in to bridge the gap, to end the turf war in the ports. I gave him a seat at my table. And he used it to study your cash flow," Nora finished, piecing the logic together. "He didn't just steal from you. He learned the routes. He mapped the safe houses. When I started digging into the construction invoices, he knew the anomaly would flag the system. He panicked. He sent Declan's men to wipe the ledger clean before I could trace the final routing number." "He didn't send them for the ledger?" Gabriel said quietly. He finally turned his head. His face was inches from hers. The grey light caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the absolute, chilling emptiness in his dark eyes. "He sent them for the auditor," Gabriel corrected. "The money is gone. The only thing standing between Colin and a quiet, peaceful life is the one person smart enough to prove he took it." Nora's stomach plummeted. The cold of the mountain finally reached her bones. She wasn't just caught in the crossfire. She was the target. "We need to keep moving," Gabriel said, pushing himself off the rock wall, leaving a dark smear against the slate. "Because if they didn't finish the job at the cabin, Colin will send more men to the logging road." The final 2 miles were a brutal exercise in diminishing returns. Gabriel's pace slowed to a staggered, uneven drag. He stopped checking his flank, his focus narrowing entirely to the 6 inches of ground immediately in front of his boots. Nora walked slightly ahead, turning back every few seconds to ensure he hadn't collapsed into the bracken. The fog had thinned slightly, replaced by a freezing, relentless drizzle that washed the remaining warmth from their bodies. "Over the ridge," Gabriel rasped, pausing to lean heavily against a birch tree. His skin possessed a waxy, translucent quality that terrified her. "Look for a rusted, corrugated roof." Nora scrambled up the final steep embankment, her fingers digging into the slick mud. When she crested the ridge, she saw it. Nestled in a shallow ravine, half swallowed by overgrown sumac and briar bushes, sat the skeletal remains of a logging way station. The roof was a patchwork of oxidized orange metal and gaping holes. A rotting wooden platform stretched out over a gravel access road that had long ago surrendered to nature. "I see it," Nora called back softly, sliding down the embankment to help him up. Gabriel didn't answer. He simply pushed off the birch trunk and waded forward, his eyes fixed dead ahead. They reached the crumbling structure 10 minutes later. The interior smelled of wet decay, animal droppings, and rust. It was dark, the only light filtering through the rusted-out holes in the ceiling. Gabriel didn't stop to rest. He limped straight to the far corner of the single room, where the concrete floor was cracked and heaving over an old root system. He dropped to his knees with a heavy, uncoordinated thud. He pulled a folding knife from his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice before managing to pry up a loose slab of concrete. Beneath the slab was hard-packed dirt. He started digging with his bare hands. "Let me do it," Nora said, dropping beside him and pushing his hands away. His knuckles were scraped white, his fingernails caked in mud. She dug furiously into the cold earth, the coarse dirt tearing at her cuticles. About 8 inches down, her fingers struck hard plastic. Together, they hauled a black pelican case out of the hole. It was heavy, sealed with a rubber O-ring that gave a soft hiss of displaced air when Gabriel unlatched it. The case was meticulously organized. Vacuum-sealed stacks of $100 bills lined the left side. Beside them lay 3 prepaid burner phones, a matte black Glock 19 with 4 extra magazines, and a robust olive-drab medical kit. Gabriel bypassed the money and the weapons. He grabbed the medical kit, unzipped it, and pulled out a foil packet. "Quick-clot combat gauze, scissors, tape." He handed them to Nora. Then, with a complete disregard for his own comfort, he grabbed the hem of his ruined shirt and pulled it over his head. Nora swallowed hard. The makeshift undershirt bandage she had applied earlier was entirely saturated, a heavy, dark red mass clinging to his back. The muscle structure of his torso was carved out of granite, but it was marred by deep purple bruising and the ugly, ragged tear of the exit wound just below his left shoulder blade. "Take the old cloth off," Gabriel instructed, his voice clipped, completely devoid of emotion. He leaned his forehead against the cold, damp concrete of the wall, bracing himself. "Wipe it down with the alcohol prep pads, then pack the wound." "Pack it?" Nora repeated, her hands hovering over his back. "The combat gauze is impregnated with a hemostatic agent. It burns. You have to push it directly into the cavity to stop the internal bleeding, or I'm going to bleed out internally before sunset." He didn't turn around. "Do it, Nora. Do not hesitate." She tore open the alcohol pads. Her hands were shaking, but her mind abruptly compartmentalized the horror. This was just another broken system. It required a fix. She wiped the blood away from the jagged edges of the wound. Gabriel's back arched slightly, the muscles locking into iron cables, but he made no sound. She opened the foil packet of gauze. It felt coarse and dry. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Then she pushed her fingers into his torn flesh, packing the gauze deep into the exit wound. Gabriel let out a low, guttural sound that vibrated in the concrete walls. His hands flexed against the floor, cracking a piece of loose stone into dust. Nora worked mechanically. tears blurring her vision, ignoring the heat of his blood on her fingers. She packed it tight, then taped a thick square dressing over the top, wrapping a wide roll of medical tape entirely around his chest to secure it. When she finished, she fell back on her heels, gasping for air as if she had been the one holding her breath. Gabriel stayed slumped against the wall for a long moment. Slowly, the rigid tension in his back began to ease. He turned to face her. His face was still pale, but the glassy, unfocused look in his eyes had receded. "You have a steady hand," he said, reaching into the kit for a bottle of water. He uncapped it and handed it to her first. Nora took a long drink, the cold water shocking her system. "I audit ledgers for a living. I find missing decimals. I don't dig bullets out of people." "You didn't dig it out, it passed through." He took the bottle back and drank the rest in one long swallow. He leaned against the wall, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "You're not an auditor anymore, Nora. Colin saw to that. You're a liability to a man who just stole $3 million and a syndicate seat." "I have the offshore routing numbers memorized," Nora said quietly. "He doesn't know that. He thinks destroying the laptop erased the trail." Gabriel tilted his head, a flicker of genuine respect crossing his exhausted features. "You memorized a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence and a series of Cayman routing codes while under fire. I memorized them at 3 a.m. when you told me to go to sleep." She wiped her bloody hands on her ruined slacks. "I didn't trust the local hard drive. I never trust the hard drive." A grim, shadowed smile touched the corner of Gabriel's mouth. "Good girl." The praise was quiet, entirely devoid of condescension. It sent a strange, sudden jolt of warmth through her chest, cutting through the freezing damp of the way station. Gabriel reached into the Pelican case and pulled out one of the burner phones. He powered it on, his thumbs moving quickly over the small keypad. He didn't have to look up contacts. The numbers he needed were stored in his head. He held the plastic phone to his ear, his eyes tracking the tree line outside the open doorway. "Arthur," Gabriel said. He didn't use a greeting. He didn't verify who was on the other end. "Status." Nora watched him listen. His face, already a hardened mask, seemed to turn to stone. The subtle lines of exhaustion around his eyes deepened. He didn't interrupt the man on the other end. He just absorbed the information, processing the shifting variables of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. "Understood," Gabriel finally said. "Keep the harbor locked down. Do not engage Colin's men directly. Let him think he owns the board for the next 12 hours. I need an extraction." He paused, listening again. "No. The main roads are burned. Send the ghost car to the old forestry gate on Route 9. 1 hour." He hung up, snapped the phone in half, and tossed the plastic pieces into the brush outside the doorway. Nora sat cross-legged on the dirt floor. "How bad is it?" "Colin moved fast," Gabriel said, returning his attention to the Pelican case. He began loading their spare magazines into his pockets. While Declan's men were hitting the cabin, Colin called a sit-down with the captains in the city, told them I was skimming the union pension funds. He used the very discrepancies you found as proof, claiming I was hoarding the cash in Delaware to fund a quiet retirement. Nora felt a cold spike of disbelief. "He weaponized the audit against you. It's a smart play," Gabriel admitted, the clinical detachment in his voice unnerving. "He steals the money, points the finger at the boss, and sends a hit squad to erase the boss and the accountant who could prove the numbers were doctored. By noon today, I'm supposed to be a dead traitor, and Colin is the reluctant savior of the syndicate." "But you're not dead." "No, I'm not." Gabriel picked up the heavy stacks of vacuum-sealed cash. He tossed them onto Nora's lap. They hit her legs with a heavy, solid thud. There is $200,000 right there, unmarked, sequential serials broken up. Nora stared down at the plastic-wrapped bricks of currency. "What is this?" "Severance," Gabriel said. He picked up the Glock, checking the chamber with a sharp, metallic slide. "Arthur is sending a car. The driver won't take you back to the city. He'll take you to an airfield in New Jersey. From there, you fly to Montreal. You use the cash to buy a new identity. You never look at a spreadsheet again." Nora didn't touch the money. She looked up at him. Gabriel was standing now, holding his ruined jacket over his freshly bandaged chest. He looked battered, lethal, and entirely serious. "I'm not going to Montreal," Nora said. "This isn't a negotiation, Nora. You're a civilian. The work you did for me is over. The moment Colin realizes his men failed at the cabin, he will put a bounty on your head so large that every street thug from Queens to Albany will be looking for you." "And what are you going to do?" She shot back, pushing the money off her lap. It hit the dirt floor. "Walk into the city with a hole in your back and take on an entire syndicate alone." "That is exactly what I am going to do." "You can't prove he took it." Nora's voice rose, echoing sharply against the corrugated roof. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in her knee. "You don't have the routing numbers. The captains won't believe you. You're walking into an execution. I don't need a ledger to kill Colin." "You do if you want to keep your empire," she insisted, stepping into his space, forcing him to look down at her. "If you just kill him, it proves his point. You look like a rogue boss tying up loose ends. You need to prove the theft. You need the numbers in my head." Gabriel's jaw tightened. He looked down at her, taking in the dried mud on her face, the blood on her hands, the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. She was terrified, trembling slightly in the freezing air, yet entirely immovable. "If you stay with me," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "there are no safe houses left. There is no perimeter. We are going to be hunted by men who do not care if you are an accountant." "I know," she whispered. Gabriel lifted a hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before his knuckles grazed the side of her cheek, wiping away a smear of dirt. The touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence surrounding them. "You're a stubborn woman, Nora." Before she could answer, the low, throaty grind of a heavy engine echoed through the fog. Gabriel's hand dropped. His demeanor shifted instantly from quiet intimacy to absolute predatory focus. He stepped past her, moving to the edge of the doorway, keeping his body pressed against the rusted metal wall. Nora held her breath. "Is it Arthur's car?" Gabriel peered through the crack in the siding. Down the gravel access road, two sets of heavy yellow headlights cut through the grey mist. They were moving slow, the tires crunching loudly over the uneven terrain. They weren't sleek sedans. They were heavy, black SUVs. "Arthur drives a Lincoln," Gabriel said, raising the Glock. The metallic click of the safety disengaging sounded deafening in the small room. "Those are Colin's sweepers." They had found the trail. The 10 minutes of rest they had stolen was over. The heavy tires of the SUVs crunched over the gravel, the sound amplified by the dense fog. Gabriel stepped back from the rusted siding. He didn't look at Nora. His entire focus was on the geometry of the room and the approaching threat. He moved with a quiet, lethal economy, gesturing sharply toward the back of the way station. Nora understood the silent command. She grabbed the handle of the Pelican case and dragged it toward the rear wall, where the concrete gave way to a deeply shadowed maintenance pit. It was a rectangular trench meant for inspecting the undercarriages of logging trucks, now filled with decades of damp leaf litter and discarded oil cans. "Get in," Gabriel mouthed. Nora didn't hesitate. She slid into the pit, her boots sinking into the wet, pungent muck at the bottom. The trench was about 4 feet deep. When she crouched, her head was entirely below the level of the main floor. Gabriel followed, dropping into the trench with a stifled grunt. He positioned himself at the edge, resting the barrel of the Glock on the concrete lip. He pulled a spare magazine from his pocket and laid it precisely 2 inches from his left hand. Outside, the vehicle engines cut off. The sudden silence was worse than the mechanical roar. It meant the men were moving on foot. Car doors opened and closed with heavy, armored thuds. Low voices muttered in the mist, coordinating angles. Nora crouched beside Gabriel's leg, her knees pressed into the freezing sludge. She hugged the Pelican case to her chest like a shield, though she knew the hard plastic wouldn't stop a rifle round. Footsteps approached the open doorway, heavy boots on wet gravel. "Look at the mud on the threshold," a gruff voice noted. "Fresh tracks. 2 sets. They're inside." Gabriel didn't move. He controlled his breathing, matching the rhythm of the dripping water falling from the rusted roof. He was waiting for them to commit. He was letting them funnel themselves through the narrow choke point of the doorway. A flashlight beam cut through the gloom, sweeping across the cracked concrete floor. The beam bounced erratically, illuminating the freshly dug hole where the cache had been buried. "Cache is empty," the voice called out. "Clear the corners." 2 men stepped over the threshold. They moved tactically, sweeping the left and right sectors of the small room with mounted weapon lights. They wore dark tactical gear, identical to the hit squad at the cabin. Colin hadn't sent local muscle. He had hired professionals. They stepped further into the room, their weight testing the rotting floorboards near the center. The structure of the old way station was treacherous. Gabriel knew this. He waited until the lead man stepped off the solid concrete and onto a section of wooden decking that was visibly sagging under the dampness. The wood groaned sharply under the man's weight. He paused, looking down. In that fraction of a second, Gabriel stood up from the trench. He didn't yell. He didn't issue a warning. He simply raised the Glock and fired 2 suppressed rounds into the center mass of the lead man. The heavy thwack of the bullets finding flesh was sickeningly loud in the confined space. The man crumpled backward, his weapon discharging wildly into the corrugated ceiling as he fell. The deafening roar of his unsuppressed rifle shattered the quiet of the mountain. The second man pivoted, aiming his light toward the trench. Before he could pull the trigger, Gabriel shifted his aim and fired twice more. The flashlight shattered, plunging the room back into a chaotic, strobe-lit darkness as outside shooters began firing blindly through the rusted walls. "Down!" Gabriel shoved Nora hard into the bottom of the pit. Bullets tore through the thin metal siding above their heads like paper. The air filled with flying rust, pulverized concrete, and the sharp scent of cordite. The noise was absolute, a physical pressure that squeezed Nora's eardrums. "They're firing blind!" Gabriel yelled over the din, crouching low over her to shield her from the falling debris. "They don't know the layout. We move now." He grabbed the handle of the Pelican case from her grip. "Follow my belt. Do not stand up." Gabriel crawled rapidly down the length of the maintenance pit. The trench extended past the rear wall of the station, ending at a heavy iron grate that emptied into a drainage culvert. He kicked the rusted grate with the heel of his boot. It didn't budge. He kicked it again, channeling his entire weight into the strike, ignoring the fresh blood seeping through his bandages. The cast iron shattered, the rusted hinges giving way with a loud screech. "Go," he ordered, pushing her toward the dark, narrow pipe. Nora scrambled through the opening. The culvert was a 3-foot-wide concrete pipe, slick with algae and freezing water. She crawled frantically, the sound of gunfire fading slightly as the thick concrete muffled the acoustics. Gabriel slid in behind her, pulling the remains of the iron grate back into place to obscure the opening. They crawled in total darkness for 50 yards. The air was foul, smelling of rot and stagnant water. Nora's hands were raw, her knees bruised, but she didn't stop until the pipe angled upward and emptied out into a steep, rocky ravine filled with dense brambles. She tumbled out into the grey daylight, gasping for fresh air. Gabriel emerged a second later. He didn't look back toward the way station. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to her feet. "They'll find the grate in 3 minutes," he said. He was breathing heavily now, a slight wheeze catching in his throat. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the physical toll of the wound was taking over. "We have a mile to the forestry gate. Keep to the rocks. Leave no footprints in the mud." They scrambled up the side of the ravine, putting a ridge between themselves and the firefight. The forest here was ancient, thick with towering pines that choked out the undergrowth. Nora matched his pace, forcing her burning muscles to keep moving. She watched Gabriel closely. His limp was pronounced now. He was carrying his weapon in his right hand and the heavy case in his left, leaving him no free hand to balance himself against the trees. "Give me the case," Nora demanded, stepping in front of him on a narrow ledge. He tried to step around her. "I have it." "You are carrying a bullet hole, Gabriel. Give me the damn case." She reached out and yanked it from his grip. It was heavier than she expected, but she locked her wrist and held it tight. "Tell me where to walk." He looked at her, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Then he simply nodded. "Due east. Follow the decline of the ridge." They walked. The silence returned to the woods, a heavy, oppressive quiet that felt like a countdown. Every snapping twig, every rustle of the wind through the dead leaves made Nora's heart spike. But she focused on the heavy plastic handle in her palm. It was a tangible anchor to reality. She wasn't just a victim running blindly. She was carrying the assets. She was part of the equation. The old forestry gate was a rusted iron bar blocking a neglected logging access road. It was flanked by deep ditches and overgrown blackberry bushes. Through the thinning fog, a vehicle sat idling quietly on the cracked asphalt. It wasn't a conspicuous luxury sedan or a tactical SUV. It was a 10-year-old, unremarkable grey station wagon. The windows were tinted dark, and the license plate was caked with dried mud. "Arthur," Gabriel said softly, the tension in his shoulders fractionally releasing. They slid down the final muddy embankment. Before they even reached the asphalt, the rear doors of the station wagon popped open. Nora threw the Pelican case into the footwell and scrambled into the back seat. Gabriel slid in beside her, pulling the door shut with a heavy metallic thud. The interior smelled of stale coffee, leather cleaner, and heavily applied aftershave. The driver didn't turn around. He was an older man, his thick grey hair neatly combed, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in the battered wagon. He put the car in drive and accelerated smoothly, steering away from the mountains without turning on the headlights. "You look terrible, boss," Arthur said. His voice was calm, possessing the smooth cadence of a man who had spent 40 years negotiating peace and ordering violence in equal measure. "I've been better," Gabriel muttered. He leaned his head back against the headrest, closing his eyes. His skin was the color of old parchment. "Did they follow the route?" "Collins' sweepers are tearing up the main highway looking for a black Lincoln," Arthur replied, his eyes checking the rearview mirror. "They don't know about this car. We have a clear run to the city limits, but the city itself is locked down. Colin called a meeting of the 5 families for 8 o'clock tonight. He's formally presenting the evidence of your embezzlement and asking for their blessing to take the seat." "He moves fast," Gabriel said, his voice weak. "He has to," Nora spoke up. The heater in the car was blasting, finally thawing the ice in her bones. "The money is sitting in a Delaware holding company. It's a temporary escrow. He needs to transfer it to offshore accounts in Panama before the feds notice the anomaly in the union pension funds. He can't initiate that transfer without triggering a banking alert on his end. He needs the families to legitimize his takeover tonight, so he can clear the funds tomorrow morning. Arthur glanced at her in the rearview mirror. The accountant. She's the reason we're alive, Arthur, Gabriel said without opening his eyes. Pleasure to meet you, miss, Arthur said smoothly. So what's the play? We have no muscle. Our safe houses are compromised. The captains think Gabriel is a thief. We can't just walk into the sit-down. We don't go to the sit-down, Nora said. Her analytical mind, fueled by the sudden warmth and the illusion of safety, began sorting the variables into a clear, aggressive strategy. We go to a terminal. Gabriel opened one eye, rolling his head slightly to look at her. A terminal. I have the 12-digit alphanumeric routing sequence memorized, Nora explained, leaning forward, resting her arms on the back of Arthur's seat. I know exactly where Colin parked that $3 million, but it's behind an encrypted firewall. I need a secure, hard-wired terminal with direct access to the SWIFT banking network. If I can get in, I can freeze the holding company. Freeze it? Gabriel asked. I can flag the Delaware LLC for international money laundering with the Treasury Department, she said, a sharp, cynical smile touching her lips. I trigger a localized audit alert. The funds will be locked in federal escrow for 90 days. No one touches it. Not you, and certainly not Colin. Arthur let out a low whistle. If Colin can't access the money, he can't pay the bribes he promised the captains to back his coup. Exactly, Nora said. He walks into that sit-down tonight, promising them a new era of wealth. If we freeze the accounts an hour before the meeting, his own financial guy will panic and tell him the money is gone. Colin will look like a liar. The captains won't back a leader who loses $3 million on his first day. Gabriel sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled his bandaged side. He looked at Nora, truly looking at her. She was covered in mud, her clothes were torn, and her hands were stained with his blood. But her eyes were sharp, calculating, and completely fearless. You want to weaponize the banking system, Gabriel said, a quiet reverence in his gravelly voice. He used my audit to frame you, Nora replied evenly. I'm going to use his bank to ruin him. Where do we find a secure SWIFT terminal in a city that's actively hunting us? Arthur asked pragmatically. Nora sat back against the leather seat. We don't need to break into a bank. We just need to go to the one place Colin wouldn't dare look for us. The one place that has secure, fiber-optic access to the global markets. Gabriel understood immediately. A dark, dangerous grin spread across his pale face. The corporate headquarters of the Walsh family, Gabriel said. Declan's legitimate front. They own a hedge fund in Midtown, Nora confirmed. Servers on the 50th floor. Secure, hardwired. If we can get into Colin's own brother's building, I can lock him out of his own vault. Arthur, Gabriel said, his voice finding its heavy resonance once more. Take us to Midtown. The transition from the wild isolation of the Catskills to the sterile, vertical canyons of Midtown Manhattan felt like crossing into a different century. Arthur bypassed the polished glass lobby entirely, navigating the station wagon down a ramp into the subterranean loading dock of the Walsh building. The dock was a cavern of concrete and humming fluorescent lights, patrolled by a single security guard scrolling on his phone. Arthur didn't draw a weapon. Stepping out in his impeccably tailored charcoal suit, he radiated the quiet, impatient authority of a senior executive whose time was being wasted. He flashed a laminated card, muttered a sharp reprimand about unauthorized freight deliveries, and walked straight to the service elevator. Intimidated by the sheer confidence of the act, the guard simply buzzed them through. Gabriel moved like a man walking underwater. Every step required a conscious, agonizing calculation. He leaned heavily on Nora as they stepped into the stainless steel box of the freight elevator. 3 minutes, Arthur said quietly, watching the digital floor indicator climb. Collins' people won't expect a breach from the inside, but the building's internal network monitors physical logins. If you trigger a firewall lockout, security will swarm the floor. I won't trigger a lockout, Nora said. The doors slid open. The 50th floor was a server farm, a sprawling, windowless expanse of humming black towers, chilled to a crisp 60 degrees to keep the processors from overheating. The air was dry and smelled intensely of ozone and hot copper. Nora moved quickly down the aisle, her muddy boots leaving faint brown smudges on the pristine anti-static tiles. At the end of the third row, she found a standalone diagnostic terminal wired directly into the primary server cluster. Dropping into the ergonomic mesh chair, her fingers hit the mechanical keyboard in a rapid, percussive clatter. She bypassed the standard employee login interface, diving directly into the command line shell. Gabriel leaned against the edge of the server rack beside her. He was fading. The waxy pallor of his skin had deepened, and his breathing was a shallow, wet rattle in his chest. Yet he kept the Glock angled down by his thigh, his thumb resting heavily on the safety. Pinging the Delaware Holding Company, Nora murmured, her eyes tracking lines of green code scrolling across the black screen. He layered it behind a corporate proxy, but used the same sub-routing protocol as the union pension funds. He's predictable. Get it done, Gabriel rasped. Nora typed a 12-digit alphanumeric sequence from memory. The command line vanished, replaced by the stark, minimalist interface of the offshore banking portal. A single account balance appeared. 140,000 Tlazuela. He's staging it, Nora said, her heart hammering against her ribs. The transfer to Panama is queued for 7:30 tonight, half an hour before the sit-down. He wants the money cleared before he faces the captains. Stop it. Nora didn't just cancel the transfer. That would only alert Collins' financial team. Opening a secondary window, she accessed the public reporting portal for the Department of the Treasury. I'm attaching the routing numbers to an anonymous tip for international money laundering, she explained, her voice tightening with adrenaline. I'm triggering a localized SWIFT freeze. It flags the account for immediate federal audit. The money gets locked in federal escrow. Untouchable. Do it. She hit the enter key. The screen froze for 3 excruciating seconds. A small loading wheel spun. Then, the balance text changed from stark white to a flashing, cautionary red. Account status: frozen. Federal hold initiated. Nora exhaled a breath she felt like she had been holding since the cabin. It's gone. Colin is broke. The heavy ding of the passenger elevator echoed from the front of the server room. Gabriel didn't flinch. He raised the Glock, his stance widening slightly despite the agony it caused him. Arthur slid a sleek, silenced pistol from his shoulder holster, flanking the server aisle. A man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored navy suit and carrying a leather tablet case, rounded the corner. He stopped dead. He was Colin's chief financial director, a man used to manipulating spreadsheets, not staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon held by a ghost. The color drained from the director's face. His tablet clattered onto the floor. Gabriel. Hello, Finch, Gabriel whispered. His voice was a rasp, but it carried the weight of an executioner's gavel. Checking on the wire transfer? Finch took a terrified step backward. Colin said you were handled. Colin is a liar, Gabriel replied. He gestured slightly with the barrel toward the terminal monitor. Look at the screen, Finch. Finch swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the flashing red text. The federal hold. His knees buckled slightly as the reality crashed down on him. The money was gone. The coup was unfunded. Walk out of this building, Gabriel instructed softly. Go to the sit-down. Tell Colin, in front of the captains, that the union money is locked in a federal vault because he was too stupid to hide his tracks. Tell them I am alive, and the penalty for treason remains unchanged." Finch nodded frantically. "Yes, I'll tell them." "Go!" Finch turned and ran, his dress shoes slipping frantically on the tiles as he sprinted for the elevator. Gabriel lowered the gun. The moment the threat was gone, the adrenaline evaporated. His knees gave out. Nora caught him before he hit the floor, wrapping her arms around his massive shoulders and lowering him gently against the server rack. "Arthur?" Nora called out, her voice cracking. "We need a doctor. Now." "I know a guy in Queens," Arthur said, quickly holstering his weapon and moving to help lift him. "No questions asked. Let's go." As they hauled him up, Gabriel's head lolled toward Nora. His dark eyes fought a losing battle against the encroaching darkness. He looked at the mud on her face, the blood on her clothes, and the fierce, protective grip she had on his arm. "You didn't go to Montreal," he murmured, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I'm keeping the severance pay," Nora whispered back, adjusting her grip to support his weight. "But I'm not done auditing your books. We have a lot of work to do." Gabriel closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a steady cadence against her shoulder. As Arthur drove them away from the glass towers into the quiet anonymity of the city, Nora knew she wasn't just a civilian anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And that is how you dismantle an empire with a keyboard. If Nora's ruthless banking hack and Gabriel's terrifying standoff had your heart pounding, smash that like button right now. The betrayal has been avenged, but the fallout is just beginning. What will the 5 families do to Colin when they find out he lost the money? Let us know your theories in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another gritty, high-stakes mafia romance on the channel. Share this video with a friend who loves suspense.